Okay, so we're beginning chapter 8. So that's the good news, final chapter. And what the theme of a lot of the theme of the final chapter is that after the verse chapter 5, 6, and 7, which describes sort of the distance and the exile and the separation, and we had all different angles from the perspective of the woman, the perspective of the beloved, or the man, the perspective of the other people in town, as we read last week, telling her, "Shuvi, Shuvi, Hashulamit, return, return." The Shulamite, in other words, trying to get her to come follow them. So after all those, that entire era of separation, verse 8 seems to be saying that she is hoping for, and ultimately probably will reach, the reunification. But the reunification is a little bit different than before. In other words, before it was still in a situation where they were in great love and they loved each other, but it wasn't, the relationship has not yet been established. So they were just in the state of courting each other. And at least in that society, when they were courting and you're not married, so the relationship is sort of under the radar. You're not going to go outside and display your love and your connection out in the public before it has been formalized in marriage. So the commentaries explain that is what's at stake here in chapter 8, where she reads as follows. The chapter 8 reads as follows, and again, this is the simple meaning. What am I saying? I'm saying, so the entire chapter is that she wants the relationship to be reestablished, but this time it should be permanent, and it should be institutionalized in the positive sense. In other words, it should be official, and therefore it should be displayed out in the open, and it should not have to be in a concealed way. So I'm going to read the first verse of chapter 8, Song of Songs, chapter 8. If you have a computer, you can Google it, either on Chabad.org or elsewhere. "Oh, that you were like my brother." In other words, she is telling him, "I want you to be like my brother, who sucked my mother's breasts," or who Yonek, who nursed from my mother's breasts. I would find you outside, I would kiss you, and they would not despise me." So what does that mean? So as Rashi will explain in the simple interpretation of the verse, is that just to express love to someone who's a stranger out in the open was not common. It was not considered modest. But your sibling has nothing wrong with expressing love to your sibling. So she says to him, "I wish you would be like my brother." In other words, if we can be like brothers and sisters, in other words, we have a relationship that's quote unquote legitimate. So then I can actually find you outside and I can kiss you outside. And when I kiss you outside, nobody would despise me. Yavozu is despise, they translate it as despise, but lavoz is to sort of ridicule or make fun of, or I guess not respect. I guess despise is not a bad word. Despise, I don't know if a perfect word, but in any case, that's what she is saying in the simple interpretation. And if you keep reading the verses, she says, "I would lead you, I would bring you to the house of my mother, who instructed me. I will give you to drink some spiced wine of the juice of my pomegranate." And it keeps going. And if you'll see next week, we're going to look at verse 6, for example. "Place me like a seal on your heart, like the seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death, zeal is as strong as the grave. Its coals are coals of fire, of a great flame." Why am I quoting that verse in verse 6? Same theme. She says, "Place me like a seal on your heart." So in those days, your seal, you wore a seal, and you either had it on your finger or you had it on your necklace. And your seal was very important. It was like your wallet. It was like your credit card, because that's how you signed. So what she is saying is, place me like a seal on your heart, meaning I always want to be close to you and next to you. Right? So she says, place me like a seal on your heart and like a seal on your arm. In other words, she wants this relationship to be not temporary, not occasionally, but permanence. And that's what she's going for. And we'll see later, like next week, what the other parts of that verse is. Why is love as strong as death? In any case, we'll get to that. But what I'm trying to say the theme is about the marriage, about institutionalizing. And if you continue verse 8, you'll see the same thing. So that's what's at stake here. So what does that mean? So that's a simple interpretation. Now we want to see, what does that mean in the historical perspective? So we'll read a little bit of Rashi. Rashi says, who, oh, that you were like my brother. Mi yitencha, who will make you, in the exact translation is mi yitencha, who will make you like my brother. In other words, we want God to be like our brother. Why brother? Right? This whole metaphor, the Song of Songs, most of the metaphor is not, is really about the metaphor of romantic love, which in some ways is superior to our love of siblings, as we have discussed many times. So all of a sudden, why in chapter 8 do we start mentioning the love of siblings? So here, Rashi says, we're talking about the brother. Which brother are we talking about? So you have to look back at the stories of the Bible. And who was the brother that you want to be like? That is, of course, the brother of the Joseph. Because you think of the story of brothers in the Bible, you have the story of Joseph with his brothers. And it's an unbelievable story, because even though the brothers sold him as a slave and, of course, mistreated him in a terrible way, yet Joseph himself went out of his way, not just not to take revenge, but to comfort them and to make them, to ease their pain when they realized that he's their brother and the terrible thing they did to him. And he is comforting them instead of them comforting him. That's what we read in the end of the book of Genesis. So looking back to verse 8, so we had this exile historically. We had the exile from God. We had the exile from Israel, which is the separation from God, which comes about because of the sins of the Jewish people, our disloyalty to God. So now we did something. We're in the wrong. We're like Joseph's brothers. But now, what says Rashi, we're asking for forgiveness. We say, "Mi tencha," we wish God that you should be like the brother. Which brother? Like Joseph. Of course, Joseph was right. But the fact that he was right and his brothers were wrong did not stop him from going out of his way to comfort his brothers. And we want God to do the same to us. That's what Rashi says. That's how you read this verse in the historical context. In other words, we're during the exile. We recognize that the pain and the separation of exile is a result of our behavior. And we say, but nonetheless, God should still forgive. What's the precedent? Precedent is, look at Joseph. If Joseph could forgive his brothers, God could forgive us. So that is Rashi. So I'll read Rashi inside. Oh, that you were like my brother, that you would come to console me as Joseph did his brothers, who did evil to him. And it is stated concerning him, Joseph, and he consoled them. There's a very powerful scene when Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers. Because remember, you know the story, and they think he's the leader of Egypt. And when he reveals his identity and he says, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? The verse says they could not answer. They were shocked, they were frightened. And they realized the ramifications of the fact that the second command to the superpower of the world is really their brother who they sold as a slave. So they were shocked, they could not answer. And what does the verse say? Joseph speaks to them and comforts them. Right? The roles have changed. Instead of them having to apologize, he goes out of his way to comfort them. Says Rashi, we tell God, okay, we sinned against you, but we didn't sin against you as much as Joseph's brothers sinned against him, right? That's a little bit worse. Whatever we did to God, we didn't sell him as a slave, okay? So now we say, if Joseph can forgive his brothers, God, you can forgive us as well. But we hope, we say, Mi tencha, who will make you like a brother? We wish you were like our brother. Okay, so that's the first half of the verse. What's the second half of the verse? I would find you outside, I will kiss you, and they will not despise me. Says Rashi as follows, I would find you outside, I will kiss you. I will find you your prophets speaking in your name, and I would embrace them and kiss them. Also, I also know that they would not despise me, for your love is worthy that your beloved should go around after you. So Rashi says, what does it mean? We will find you outside. Find you outside. Outside means that we're distant from Hashem. And nevertheless, even though we're distant from Hashem, nevertheless, you can find God outside. What does it mean, finding God outside? Because God, of course, dispatched the prophets to come to the Jewish people and rebuke them. So now what we're saying is, even when we're sinning, we find God's voice reaching us outside, out in the distance. And that's through the words of the prophets. And of course, we will kiss you. Rashi says we kiss the prophets. In other words, we embrace and kiss the words of the prophets because we take those words to heart. And you will not despise me. They will not despise me. Lo yavozu li. In the verses, they will not despise me. Who's they? So the conventional interpretation is they is the spectators. But Rashi is saying is they is the prophets, because the prophets know that even though the Jewish people are sinning, but the Jewish people are still God's beloved, and they are worthy of following God. So that's the story. In other words, just to summarize quickly, we're talking about we're in exile, but we're already looking toward chapter 8 is going to be the reunification, and not just reunification to the romance and to the excitement of the courting, but it's going to be a situation, as we will see, marriage. In other words, formalizing the relationship. And in this process, it didn't happen yet, but that's what she's hoping for. In this process, according to Rashi is saying is that even when we're distant, we still find God outside, in the sense that God sends the prophets. And if we don't have prophets today, but we still have the words of the prophets. This is sort of God's words speaking to us outside. We're outside, meaning we're not in his home. We're not in Israel. And even if we're in Israel figuratively, but we're not yet in Israel spiritually. In other words, we're not yet in the state of redemption. And the words of God, but nevertheless, because we seek God, we find God outside in the words of the prophets. So this is the simple interpretation plus the historic interpretation. And now we move a little bit to the Hasidic interpretation. But in the meantime, as always, comments, questions, always welcome. Give me just a second.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I can't but help make comparisons to where we are in the parasha, where Abraham claims that Sarah is his sister. So
right.
All these kind of attempts to make a romantic relationship more of a platonic relationship to fool the outside. Is there any parallel there, or is it simply that?
So the Kabbalah would say the same thing about Abraham. When Abraham says, say you're my sister, it has to be true, right? You can't lie. It's not a lie. So Rashi already addresses as Abraham saying something that's not true. So Rashi says, it's actually very interesting. Rashi says, in a way, Sarah is his sister. Why? Because Sarah is his niece.
His
brother's daughter. And in biblical Hebrew, father could be a grandfather, and a child could be a grandchild, and a child of a sibling could be a sibling, and you have examples for that all throughout the Torah, right? Abraham turns to Lot and he says, "We're brothers," right? So if Lot is Sarah's sister, if Lot is Avram's brother, then Sarah is sister, and then Sarah is Avram's sister. So in other words, that's the technicality. That's why Avram is not lying, because she's his wife, but she's also his sister. Now, what does that do for us? So when you look at the Hasidic commentary on those verses, the Hasidic commentary is saying the same thing. He says that Abraham and Sarah represent the connection and the love between God and the Jewish people. And as we mentioned many times in the book, there are two forms of the relationship. There's the romantic relationship and there's the natural relationship, like siblings. And what Avram is telling us, at this time, when we're going to Egypt, we have to fall back on the natural love, because sometimes the romantic love is challenged. Romantic love, by definition, because it's like a fire, it goes up, it goes down, and sometimes it's going to recede. And when it recedes, you can't expect it to be in the full force, full flame, going 80 miles per hour the entire time. It just doesn't work that way. So when you're going down to Egypt, what does Egypt represent? We know in the Kabbalah, Egypt represents limitation, concealment. The light of God is concealed. So what Abraham is telling Sarah. Sarah is like the body. In other words, Sarah is like the Jew in this world, and Abraham is like the soul. And what Abraham is telling Sarah, when you go to a spiritual Egypt, when you go to a state of spiritual constraint, you may not have the passionate love of a romantic love, but you always have, the soul is always this quote unquote sibling, in the sense that there's always deep down a natural love, that because we're one and the same, we're connected. In the Hebrew, the word achot and ach comes from the word ichui, which means a bonding. You're bonded to your siblings in a way that's constant. It's not always revealed, but in the soul level, it's constant. So you're right, Bob, that it's the same theme. We have both those elements of the relationship, and the question is, which one are we going to highlight? Now, what you said is very much related to what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to talk about, because in a sense, there's a mistaken notion, but it's a common notion, that once a person gets married, the passion of the romance of the courting time recedes, right? In other words, you're institutionalizing the relationship. And in that sense, that is an advantage, because what you get is you get peace and you get security and you get trust and you get covenant. You get all kinds of wonderful things in a relationship. But what you don't have is the excitement and the passion that comes before it was institutionalized. And it seems like there is this conflict. And if you look at verse 8, where the commentaries explain she's looking for a permanent relationship, it seems on the surface, before we get to the Kabbalistic interpretation, it seems on the surface that the woman is already, she passed her 20s, she's in her 30s, she said, I have enough excitement of dating, now I want marriage. Now, marriage, it's going to be institutionalized. I'm going to be able to express my love in the open. I'm going to kiss you, nobody's going to laugh, no one's going to despise me. But what it seems like is, like Bob says, we're going to be siblings, we're not going to be lovers. In other words, we're not going to have that passion that comes about from two people who do not have a covenant, who are not connected, who are separate, and yet they love each other. And therefore, for that love to bring them together, you need that passionate love. So you're spot on, and we're going to see how Rabbi Shneur Zalman deals with this in a revolutionary way. It's revolutionary in the spiritual sense, in the historic sense, but also in a sense that it could be applied to any relationship. But it seems like you're spot on that at some point when you marry, you become you're sacrificing some of that excitement, some of that romance. It could be on the surface, and that's what it seems like she's doing. But we're going to revisit that, and we're going to see if it's not exactly that way, because you have to look at the whole verse in its entirety, and then you get the full picture. So I hope that at least addresses what you were raising.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So now we make some progress. So to get to the Hasidic perspective, you have to talk about we have to figure out the terms. In other words, we're going to talk about what is a brother and what is not the brother, and how does this apply in a spiritual sense. So we're going to go on a little bit detour, then we come back. So the first thing we're going to say is, in the times of the temple, it's a little bit different than what I said till now, but things will hopefully fall into place. In the times of the temple, we are considered God's brothers. There's a verse in Psalms that is a beautiful Shlomo Karabach tune too. We say it at the end of davening every day. Leman achai v'rei. You may have heard the song. Leman achai v'rei. Let me just find out exactly which psalm it is. We'll be able to read it at the exact translation. Leman achai v'rei. So it's if you want to really think about it, it's Tehillim Kuf Chavei. So it's Tehillim 122. Psalm 122. So what does the psalm say? For the sake of my brothers and friends, Adabra na shalem bach, I speak peace with you, meaning I want you to have peace. I want there to be peace within you. Okay, let's see their translation. I'm on Sefaria. So let's see. For the sake of that, okay, for the sake of my kin and friends, but it's achai, for the sake of my brothers and friends, I pray for your well-being. Not a great translation. Adabra na, I speak shalom bach, there should be peace within you. Who are we talking about? We're talking about Jerusalem. If you look at the whole psalm, it's an absolutely beautiful psalm, Psalm 122, a song of ascents of David. I rejoiced when they said to me, we are going to the house of the Lord. So the psalm describes how when the people would travel to the temple and the pilgrimage, how they would sing on the way. Our feet stood inside your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem built up, a city knit together, to which tribes would make pilgrimage. The tribes of the Lord, as was enjoined upon Israel to praise the name of the Lord. In other words, the Jews have an obligation, and the tribes went to Jerusalem. What else happened in Jerusalem? There's also the seat of justice. There the thrones of judgment stood, thrones of the house of David. Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May those who love you be at peace. May there be well-being within your ramparts, peace in your citadels. Beautiful. So we're talking about Jerusalem. Now we get, for the sake of my kin, of my brothers and friends, I pray for your well-being. Then we continue, for the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I seek your good. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman reads this psalm, and he says, what do we see here? We see here that when the temple stood, we're talking about Jerusalem and its glory. We're talking about Jerusalem when the Jewish people would have the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So when the temple stood, we were referred to as Leman Achai V'Re'ai, as God's brothers. God's brothers means, again, we're connected, the relationship is constant, and we're close together. So that's when the temple stood. Spiritually speaking, that is also the level of the tzaddik. In general, there are two types of Jews. There's the tzaddik. The tzaddik is the person who's righteous. In other words, he walks in the path of God. He's always connected to God. And then there's the path of someone who does teshuvah, who returns, the Baal teshuvah, the returnee. In other words, at some point they were distant from Hashem, and then they return. So what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, if you're talking about the brother, when you say brother, Leman Achai, for the sake of my brother, if you're talking about historically, in the times that the temple stood, we were God's brothers. Within every individual, when I am in the state of a tzaddik, when I'm in the state where I want to be close to God, I'm not distant, we're connected, then I'm God's brother. Then I have the temple within my soul is standing. And that's wonderful. So that's the first half of the verse. Then you get to the second half of the verse. What's the second half of the verse? Second half of the verse, I mean the Song of Songs. So, oh, that you will be like my brother who nurses my mother's breasts. In other words, we're connected to God. We're God's brother. What does that refer to? That refers to the level of a tzaddik. First of all, it refers to the level of times of the temple. That's historically, but also within every person's soul, it refers to the person who is a tzaddik, or even more, I would say, the times that we are a tzaddik. There are certain areas where we're a tzaddik, we're righteous. If you woke up in the morning and you didn't have a desire to rob a bank, in that sense, you're a tzaddik. You're holy, you're righteous. You don't struggle with the temptation. And that is the brother. Okay. But then you get to the second half of the verse. What's the second half of the verse? I would find you outside. I find you outside. The way Rabbi Shneur Zalman reads it, it's two different clauses. You have I wish I would be like your brother. That's the righteous person. That's the times of the temple, either literally or figuratively. But then what about the person who is not righteous? Either historically they're outside of Israel. I will find you outside. Or within their own soul, they have sinned. They're distant from God. They betrayed what they know to be true, and then they come back. Now they're not righteous. They're not God's brother. If you're brother, you wouldn't offend me that way. It wouldn't hurt you that way. But what am I? Now I'm outside. And that's the Baal Teshuvah, the person who finds God outside in the distance. So there's two paths in this verse, in verse 8. Now we're going to say something that we said many times throughout the verse, throughout the book. So there's no news here. It's just reiterating. But then we get to the deeper interpretation, which is almost revolutionary. So what happens? Which level of love is greater? Is it better to be God's brother, or is it better to find God outside? Is it better to be a tzaddik, someone who never sinned, someone who's not challenged with the evil, or someone who is about teshuvah, someone who was distant and finds within them the strength and the passion and the dedication and determination to return to God? So which is greater? Which love is greater? So of course the right answer is it depends what you're referring to. It depends in which aspect. But let's look at verse 8. What does verse 8 tell us? In other words, chapter 8, verse 1. What is this verse telling us? So we have, oh, that you were like my brother who sucked my mother's breasts. I would find you outside. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the next word, I will kiss you. Where is kiss you? Kiss represents a very deep connection, face to face, more than an embrace, my mouth to mouth. So kiss is a very deep and powerful romantic connection. Where does it say I will kiss you? It doesn't say I'm going to kiss my brother. It says I'm going to kiss you when I find you outside. So again, in the simple interpretation, it's the same story. The woman tells the man, I wish you were like my brother. And then if you're like my brother, when I find you outside, I will kiss you. But that's the simple interpretation. That's not the Kabbalistic interpretation. Kabbalistic interpretation is there's two clauses in the verse. It's even divided by et nachta, which is separation. In other words, the cantillation, the truck, there's a imi. Mi tanchahu, after mother, it stops. Then the second clause, so it's either, I wish I could be like your brother, that's clause number 1. Clause number 2, or I could find you outside. And if I find you outside, I will kiss you. And that represents a much greater level of connection to God, because the kiss is face to face and it's more powerful and it represents a deeper love. What does that tell you? That specifically the one who finds God outside, specifically the one who finds God in a distance, after they were distant, they have a greater yearning, they have a greater appreciation to God, more than the person who never sinned. And if you want to talk about it historically it would be the same idea that when we're in the distance, when we find God in the exile, then our yearning and passion to God is much deeper than the way it was in the times of the temple. Because times of the temple, we were like brothers. We were living together the entire time. No, if you're living together the entire time, you don't really appreciate the other person. When you have the distance creates the longing, as we said many, many times, one of the recurring themes of the verse. So that's wonderful. And if I send you off the phone right now, it's very good. Someone will ask you, what did you learn today? You would say, well, I learned there's two paths. Is the path that you can be God's brother and you can find God outside. In other words, you could be righteous, or you could be someone who was distant and then returned, and each one has an advantage. And the advantage of being distant, of finding God outside, is that the love is increased, and the love is more passionate. And there's a kiss. And historically, you could say the same thing, that there's an advantage, of course, of living in the times in the temple, but there is also a spiritual advantage of living in the exile. And that's a very inspirational message, but it's a message that we said many times in the last 8 chapters. So it's not going to be news. It will be inspiring and nice, but it won't be news. Here comes the revolution. Here comes the revolution. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman. If you look at this verse, both are in the same verse. What the Torah is doing is what the song is doing is juxtaposing both the brother and finding you outside. In other words, you could be a brother and you can find God outside, the same person at the same time. In other words, you could be righteous, and even though you're righteous, you could incorporate the passion of the person who was distant and returned. Or in simple English, you could be married, the relationship could be established and formalized, and yet you can have that same passion that you had when the relationship was not formalized, when you were courting and you were not sure if the other person wants you, and you had to go out of your way to show your love, and you had to overcome barriers, and you had to knock on the door even when it was raining at night, as we described all the scenes in the past. And you had to go ask the guy, where are you pastoring, because he didn't tell you, and you have to pursue all the other beautiful descriptions that we had in the last 7 verses. You can have all that, and you can have a brother all together simultaneously. In other words, what this verse is telling you, and again, we're going back to the simple interpretation. The simple interpretation is that this verse is about, what is she dreaming about? What does she want? She wants to formalize the relationship. So the verse says, I want to formalize the relationship, but I want to be your brother, but I also simultaneously will find you outside. I'm going to incorporate that same love that we had from the time that we were distant, from the time that we were not together. And the big news of verse 8 is the idea that both of these could stand together. This is based on a verse on a statement of the Zohar. The Zohar says that when Mashiach comes, even the righteous are going to have to repent. Even the righteous, the tzaddik, is going to do teshuvah. So you say, what do you mean the tzaddik is going to do teshuvah? Teshuvah means to return to God. But if you were never distant, how could you return? Right? So what does this mean? The Zohar says when Mashiach comes, the righteous will also repent. So the answer is, it doesn't mean that they're going to repent in the simple sense. They're going to say, oh, I'm sorry, I did something wrong. I was distant from God. They were never distant from God. But what it means is when Mashiach comes, the quality and the passion of the love of the person who's returning will also be passed on to the righteous. The righteous will be able to incorporate within their own service of God the same passion and the same kiss that you get in the distance. Oh, so now this is a revolution. This is something we have never heard, because like Bob said, we heard many times the idea that there's different forms of relationship. There's the consistent relationship with a sibling, and then there's the passionate relationship of a spouse, of a romantic relationship that we heard many times. And we always said it's one or the other, or at times you can have one, or at times you can have the other. What we're saying here is that it's possible to have both outside. It's both together. In other words, even when Mashiach comes, we'll be able to have the yearning that we had in exile. Go ahead, Bob.
Is this a partial explanation why the Rebbe never went to Israel and felt more comfortable in exile?
That could be. He didn't really explain exactly. He didn't really give a succinct interpretation of why he never went to Israel. He gave multiple interpretations. They're probably interrelated and interconnected. He gave a halachic interpretation, which is that it's somewhat problematic to leave Israel once you go. That's a halachic issue, but also the issue that he felt that his work was more necessary outside of Israel, and You're talking about a person who never took a vacation. So it's not like he went on vacation to Miami and say, oh, you should have gone to Tel Aviv, right? He never took a day of vacation in more than 40 years. So he was very focused. So that could be, that was another reason. But what Bob is alluding to, I think, is that in a certain sense, I don't want to say this is the reason why the Rebbe didn't go to Israel, but in a certain sense, the Hasidic movement as a whole is a movement that, even though they were very connected to Israel, and one of the first, in the first generation, second generation of the Hasidim, a lot of them moved to Israel. Rabbi Shneur Zalman himself almost moved to Israel. He actually started traveling to Israel with his teacher, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach, who later ended up in Tiberia and Tiberias and was buried in Tiberias. So there was a big group of Hasidim in the early generations who went to Israel. But together with that, the Hasidim understood that there's really no such thing as outside, as distant. What's distant? Distant is the place where you can find God and kiss God. Okay, so there is an advantage to the separation. Now, we're not saying we want to stay separate. Of course, we want Mashiach to come and we want to be reunited. But the problem is, when we're reunited, the problem is we may be sacrificing some of that yearning, some of that passion. And that's a normal, natural occurrence. People have it in their marriage every day, where they're not as in love as they were before they formalize the relationship, because that's the price to pay. It seems like it's a price to pay. You're either righteous or you're returnee. We were either always together or we're overcoming distance. How do you have both together? How could you be close and have the benefit of distance? Right? But that's the deeper level. That's true marriage, and that's true relationship, and that's the true marriage, and that's what we're describing. That's what after chapter 8, in other words, after chapter 7, 5, 6, and 7 describes the distance. And now we say, you know what? We can actually capture the feeling and the yearning of the distance, and we can incorporate it within a formalized relationship. Because when Mashiach comes, that's what we're going to happen. That's what's going to happen. When Mashiach comes, we become close to God. There's no temptation. There's no separation that we have to overcome. And yet, because we experience the yearning, because we experience the passion, now I could say in the formal relationship with God, as a brother, we also have the kiss that can only be found outside. So that's true historically. It's true within the soul of every person. But like I said, it's also true. This is also, of course, a lesson in the simple sense of what a relationship and what is marriage, where it's possible. So don't give up, because it's possible to have, once you tasted the distance, which everybody has. The whole courting idea is we're distance with two people who are unrelated, do not have a covenant, do not have a bond, and yet we're going out of our way to connect. That experience could be replicated even when we're like brothers. In other words, where the relationship has been formalized. So I think that if you want to talk about advancing the understanding of what a relationship is, relationship between people, but also relationship between God and the Jewish people, I think that this verse is actually moves the ball forward, right? We have a few big ideas in the Song of Songs that keep repeating itself, but this is a new idea. This is a new step. This is something to work on. This is something that we're saying, that what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, don't read the two half of the verses as two separate clauses like it would appear. In other words, when you read it spiritually, it's two separate clauses. You have the brother, that's the righteous, that's the times of the temple. And then you have the person finds God outside. And that's the person who's distant from God, going to return, returning, but distant from God. And the person who's in exile, both spiritual and physical. And they're two separate states, and they have two different stories. One is, I feel close to you, right? I nurse from my mother's breast. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says that means that relationship with God nurtures you, just like a child's growth. When a child is nursing, the child grows far more than he would the entire life. And that's what we're saying. That relationship with God, of being God's sibling, quote unquote, means that we're nursing from the Torah, from God's nourishment. But the point here is that that's one story when we study Kabbalistically. And the second story is finding God outside and having a kid and kissing God outside, because outside is the greater passion. And then that's so far, that's the model. That already Bob knew from everything he knew from learning Chassidus and Kabbalah and the Torah earlier. You already understood these two models. So comes Rabbi Shneur Zalman and says, 1 second, both these models are in the same verse. When the woman is coming after the pain of distance, and she says, I want to formalize the relationship. I want marriage. I want to constantly be on your arm and on your heart, as we said later, as we said in verse 6. We'll get to that next week. Okay. So I want a constant relationship. constant relationships doesn't work. It doesn't work if you can't find the person outside if you're constantly with them. And it's not outside. Outside means the distance. But that's what she understands. That's the new idea that she comes to, the maturity that she comes to in chapter 8. That you can formalize the relationship and yet still have the passion of the outside, finding the person outside. So all I'm trying to say is we advance the story in chapter 8. It's not just repeating the same theme in different way, in poetic way, which we do a lot of because that's really what poetry is. That's what a song is. You repeat and you bring it out in many different scenarios, the same point. But this I think is a new point. This is a new step. This is news. This we haven't heard before, that you can do both. We heard, like we said earlier, when you go to Egypt, fall back on the sister relationship. Right? In other words, when you can't experience the passionate love, fall back on the natural love. That we heard. But to be able to have both simultaneously, that you have to read after 7 chapters of understanding what love is, then you come to chapter 8, and then you can reach the true definition of a relationship, which is where the formalizing of the relationship, the fact that it's consistent, and the fact that it's a covenant, and no matter what you're going to be, the fact that it's unconditional does not take away from the finding the person outside. You're able to create that passion you had within yourself, and you're able to recreate it and preserve it simultaneously while being in a formal, established relationship. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. God willing, next week we continue with chapter 8. Questions, comments, please share. But that's it for today. Have a wonderful Shabbos, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have a question about the number of verses. Today we're at verse 8, and we know the meaning of verse 8, and we kind of parallel it to coming of Mashiach. So my question is about where the numbers come from. Is it something that King Solomon did, or this is something that?
So this is very good. You're very Kabbalistic. You're going to number 8, which is beautiful because 7 is nature, and 8 is surpassing nature. And in a relationship, it's not natural to what I just said. It's to be hard for you to understand. In other words, it's hard for me to understand. But this is the value. We can actually do 2 opposing things. It's a paradox to be able to have both these feelings together. If we can do that, that's because we go beyond nature. We're going to number 8. So it's certainly connected to number 8. But thank you for that, because I did not think of that. Who divided the chapters? It was not a Jewish source. It's not King Solomon. And therefore, you can argue that says the fact that it's chapter 8 is just by mistake. But on the other hand, the Rebbe always said, if for whatever reason the chapters were divided this way, and for whatever reason the Jews adopted this division into chapters, even though we know that it doesn't come from a Jewish source. But if at the end of the day, if that's what the Jewish people adopted, so it says in the early commentaries, the Rashba was famous for this. He says, Minhag Yisrael Torahi. If you have a custom of the Jewish people, it becomes Torah. So if the people do something, it has the force of the Torah. So since people refer to this as chapter 8, it's chapter 8. And therefore the Rebbe would always, not always, but sometimes find connections between the theme of the parsha and the chapter. For example, the Song of Ha'azinu in the end of the Deuteronomy is chapter 32. And we know 32 is Lev, his heart. So the Rebbe would say chapter 32 is the heart of the Torah, at least the heart of the book of Deuteronomy. But chapter 32, no, Moses never said it's chapter 32. It doesn't come from a Jewish origin. Doesn't matter. If the Jewish people refer to it for 1,000 years as chapter 32, that becomes Torah. That has spiritual significance as well.
Thank
you for that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Have
Can I
a
ask something afterwards?
Of course.
Hi. So I know this is a very busy time for you, so I feel I'm not happy that I have to ask you this, but the Sachnut in its wisdom has decided that the letter you gave me can't be authentic because there was no indentation from your pen. So, there.
Okay. I didn't sign it. I guess I didn't press hard enough, I guess.
Yeah. At first they said you have to change the color of the ink. I said, it's already blue. It's not, and they said, well, because we didn't feel any indentation, it couldn't have been an authentic signature.
Right. I gave you the hard copy, right?
You
I gave
did.
you the hard copy.
Yeah,
Okay, so I guess I'll try again.
I'm sorry. I
No,
apologize.
no problem. I'll try again. God willing, I'll give it to you on beginning of next week, Sunday,
Okay.
Monday. I should be in
Let
Greenwich on
me
Sunday.
know. I mean, I know it's a very busy time in your family, so I don't want to.
No, I'm happy to do it. It's no big deal. It's just that I'm not going to be there. I'm not coming back to Greenwich till later today, so maybe we'll do it on Sunday.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
And I'll just put it in the, I'll put it in the box and I'll tell you when it's available. So in case I'm not there.
Perfect, thanks. And the other thing, when you have
Hey,
a
let me
chance,
just turn this off. 1 second. Let me just turn this off because I think I'm still recording.
oh, you're right.